Welcome to Boombastic Health, where we challenge the business of healthcare and explore bold ideas that drive meaningful change. Each week, we bring you candid conversations with top experts, innovators, and leaders, exploring the latest trends and technologies shaping the future of healthcare. Join us and be part of the conversation in transforming healthcare. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Boombastic Health. I'm your host, Bradley Bostic. Today, we have a really important topic for the MedTech industry, and that's about real-world data and how real-world data is being used to advance the development of medical device products. And I've got a fantastic guest here with me today, Dr. Amelia Hufford. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amelia Hufford.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brad. Nice of you to invite me.
Absolutely. So Amelia and I are co-founders of Aware, in full disclosure, which is the leader in delivering real-world data for medical device companies. So that's why we have this topic today, is that we've had some real-world experience with delivering real-world data in a very powerful way. But before we get into that, I wanted Amelia to talk a bit about her experience. So she's been for 20 years in the scientific and clinical research world, and she spent a decade in MedTech leading regulatory and clinical affairs to secure and sustain market access for medical products. So at TreeAware, Dr. Hufford's pioneering new ways to use real-world data to reveal patient outcomes and demonstrate product value without the need for costly, protracted studies, which at a high level might sound like a whole bunch of jargon, but in reality, it's a really, really big issue. And I use the example of, if we don't gain more efficient ways to access real-world data for medical device, we will lose about a third of all the medical device products that are on the market. And so one might say, well, are there just too many out there? Well, think about the device that was developed, for example, for a newborn that needs some type of life-saving procedure. And if it's too expensive and just not economically feasible to keep that device on the market, you could end up losing that device, which ends up literally being a life and death issue. So this work is incredibly important. And I'm super glad to have you on the show, Amelia. And I'd love to have you tell a little bit of your story, how you got into healthcare, how you became so passionate about this innovation, and where you see all of this going.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Happy to. I think probably my first sort of inkling that I wanted to pursue healthcare professionally. So my mother, she's a registered nurse. She was an RN for over 40 years. She retired when my oldest daughter was born. And I remember she had her nursing books, her nursing school books out when I was growing up. And I remember kind of flipping through them. And I remember like being both at the same time really intrigued and kind of grossed out. So I remember just always having a fascination. And initially my fascination was around infectious diseases. Those, combined with my mom's textbooks. I remember the movie Outbreak was really big when I was growing up, and I wanted to be a virologist or some type of scientist working in the CDC with the BSL-4 suits and everything. As I went to college and I studied microbiology, both in undergrad and in my PhD, I realized, I liked the bench aspects of being a scientist, but I'm kind of a social scientist. I love talking with folks and I love communicating, and I love kind of being on the front end of science where, you get to develop products that actually translate into patient care. So after my PhD, I had done some work in between my undergrad and PhD and some research labs. And I was thinking, okay, typically what happens is you go on and do a postdoctoral fellowship, and you do that for a few years, and then you hope to get an assistant professorship somewhere. And I really wanted to be more hands-on with product development through a friend of mine who I went to graduate school with. She got me connected into regulatory science. So what regulatory science is, essentially, you are basically the person who helps understand what the requirements are going to be, either from FDA or EMA or whichever regulatory authority you're submitting to, understand what they're going to want to see with regard to data and with regard to your product design information. And my background in microbiology, I was always kind of interested initially in some of the the sterilization methods, some of the design aspects of devices. I'm not an engineer, but I love that aspect. Probably if I had to do it again, I might go into engineering. And I thought, wow, this is really neat. These are products that are being designed, being created, and in a matter of a couple of years, they're going to be helping patients directly. Um, and what I really liked about regulatory science is that, you get to basically help the teams know what they need to do in order to get those products on the market as quickly as possible. So from there, I actually got more and more connected to clinical science. And probably what became my most favorite part of the day to day was learning about what are the preclinical studies, data that need to be collected in order for the device to be determined to be safe to use in a small pilot study. And then what are the benchmarks, what are the outcomes, what are the ways you're going to determine success that clinically for a regulatory authority to allow your device to come to market. And so I moved from regulatory science into clinical science when I worked at Cook Medical. And that happened towards the end of 2019. And I joined the team actually not to look at the pre market requirements, but we were actually looking at the post market requirements for data. And the reason why a regulator might actually force you to collect data on devices after they've been on the market is because the pre-market studies that go into a submission, go into the technical documentation, those, and this is true for MedTech, this is true for pharma, those are very narrow in scope and very tightly controlled because by design. You usually have very stringent enrollment, inclusion or exclusion criteria. And once you have, the medical devices out in the wild, utilized all, in various different forms, perhaps they're not as safe or they, aren't being performing as intended when you have a broader population. So that's where I focused my career right before joining
So within the medical device world, there's this idea of pre-market clinical trials, which is a way to say that there's a product that or a device that is not yet in the market and you need to test it out to make sure that it's going to work as expected. And in those trials, there's an approach to putting the data together and identifying whether it's working or not that differs from real world data, right? Because it's a
Exactly.
controlled environment. So could you describe that a bit? Because I think this
Yeah.
whole world of data is so big and there's so much
Yes.
going on that I think people maybe don't understand the difference.
No, that's a good point to pick on. I think, anytime you're doing, I guess you could call it an experiment, you try to control for all of the various extrinsic factors or variables that can, be an input to your results. So anything that might affect your results, you want to minimize and control so that they're repeatable. And that's great for a scientific study. And also when you're running a clinical trial, you want to again have as homogeneous a patient population as possible. You want to kind of choose patients that are going to have the same comorbidities. They're going to have a lot of the same, factors, because as you start to have more and more diversity in your patient population, which isn't a bad thing, you have more and more diversity in the outcomes that may have nothing to do with your product. And so, by design, clinical trials usually are designed to be have very defined patient groups. Be conducted under very controlled conditions. And what real world data allows you to do is look at how your products, your medicines, your medical devices, how they perform in broader, more representative populations. And you can also look when you're working with real world data, you can look at subgroups who might be a very, very small minority or hard to enroll in a clinical study. And you you can look at and analyze how your products work in those patients as well. So there's a lot of good reason for that. There's need for both. There's need to have those highly controlled, very I don't call them artificial, but very controlled studies, as well as what's going on in the real world to supplement those knowledge gaps.
Right. You don't want to put a new technology out there in patients without having quite a lot of an upfront study. But then
Right.
once that device is out in the wild, though, it's like who knows what's going to happen. It reminds
Exactly.
me of like the Jurassic Park thing, where it seems like a great idea to put all these dinosaurs out there, and then you put them out there and you find out, well, they morph and evolve and stuff
Yeah.
goes on. And sometimes
Yeah.
that goes really well, sometimes it doesn't. In the case that things are going well, sometimes there are devices that have even a dish application beyond what they were originally approved for. And that's
Yes.
like label expansion, right? And
Yes.
historically, to get to label expansion, it took a lot of almost like luck and I don't know, some kind of black magic. And so now with using more advanced technology and using natural language understanding, AI, these kinds of technologies, we're now able to start identifying where you can put in place devices for additional uses that maybe before you didn't realize that they weren't initially approved for. Could you describe that? And is there an
Yeah.
example you can give of that where a label
Yeah.
expansion?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. Okay. So I've got one that's been on my mind. I don't know if you saw the Emmys last night.
I saw some of the highlights afterward. I didn't watch it, but I saw some highlights. Yeah,
Okay, so have you seen or heard of the new hospital drama, The Pit, with Noah Wiley?
I've heard of it.
Okay, I highly recommend it. I've seen some reports that it's actually very well done by ER physicians are saying it's probably one of the most accurate hospital dramas that you can see. But one thing I just geeked out on. So number one, the premise of that show is it's basically the day in the life of a seasoned kind of battle worn ER attending who's Noah Wiley's character, Dr. Ravi. And it's basically each episode is an hour of that day. And number one, if you want to see how important medical devices are and access to medical devices, it's a great show because they use a ton. And actually, two of the devices that are used in the season the season are actually devices we're running studies on ourselves at 3Aware. And so I was geeking out, kind of watching it. But actually, one of the devices that I am familiar with, that device was used off label. And what that means is it was used in a way not intended by the device's labeling information. So, in their instructions for use, it talks about intended uses, intended patient population, and this was a off-label use, but it saved a patient's life. And after they did this thing and the patient survived, they were saying, well, I read about this use in such and such journal of emergency medicine. And I think what's interesting is, a lot of times I think in emergency medicine specifically, there are physicians, um, the first rule is that they take care of the patient. They do no harm. And so they have to use whatever is available to them to get a patient through whatever is happening. And without giving too much away, yeah, this device is used for one purpose. It was used off label for another purpose, but it helped that patient relieve pressure in their brain from a bleed that was happening. And that kind of data is really interesting, maybe not as dramatic as that, but we see it in other cases as well, where you may have a device used for one purpose in emergency medicine, and then you see that it's also used during orthopedic surgeries, and perhaps that application is very beneficial to patients. And what you can do is from the practice of medicine shifts over time, so following how your products are being used, see where there's good outcomes for patients by reading the literature, looking at real world data, collecting that real world data to assess if the patients are having good outcomes, if there's not a lot of safety signals. That can then you can use that to expand your label or expand your clinical indications through either FDA or European regulator review. And then you can market towards those uses and new applications. And so it really, it allows you to be innovative with products that exist on the market because that's what physicians are doing. They're using these products, they're using these tools, whatever's available to them, and understanding how that's happening is really important for manufacturers.
So when I think about the impact of that for a medical device company, a MedTech company, it costs a lot to design and develop and launch a new device. And
Yes.
if I have an existing device that is able to be applied to unlock additional value for patients and also additional revenue, candidly income
Right.
for the device, it's just an incredibly powerful equation. It's way beyond what historically technology was really doing for the med tech industry. So in the case of 3Aware specifically, the technology is going in and identifying these areas where there may be label expansion because it's seeing, hey, here are all the ways that this device was used. Or can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So what 3Aware does, we are able to access patient medical records that have been de-identified, and we can assess the partners, the health systems that we partner with. They are very integrated health systems in that we've got access to primary care, emergency medicine, specialty, all available within the single instance of the electronic medical record. So we've got all of that longitudinal data where we can really follow a patient's journey. With our platform, the 3Ware platform is able to ingest that data and present it either surrounding a procedure in which a patient was treated with a particular device or it doesn't necessarily have to be device specific. We can pull cohorts of patients that have been treated with specific procedure codes within a period of time. And one important aim for what's called post-market clinical follow-up, which is a requirement of medical device manufacturers to comply with currently in Europe, but you see it in other areas as well, is to look for how your products are being used, if there's any misuse, or if you need to update any of your labeling, if you're seeing significant off label use. And really, the only way to do that in a clinical study type application is with real world data. So we're able to look at specific devices used in procedures with maybe specific procedure codes, so we can specifically look for off-label usage. Or sometimes it's a matter of not procedure codes but age of patient, so we can look for if it's perhaps they're wanting to gather data on pediatric populations, because traditionally running a study on a pediatric population is very hard. There's a lot of ethical considerations, and gathering that data from real world data is another way to do that. And again, we're able to do that with the 3Aware platform, zeroing in on those patients within a certain age group. So yeah, what access to real world data does, especially access to retrospective real world data, you can look back in time and you can quickly enroll a specific number of patients that meet the criteria you're looking for, and that can include specific indications which may currently be off label.
So this makes so much sense. And there's no reason that I can't I can't think of a reason that this wouldn't become the standard for how innovation is driven on the real world data side for medtech. Like,
Yeah.
what are the challenges? What are the things that are impediments, and then any major breakthroughs that you're foreseeing moving forward that might start to knock down those barriers?
Yeah. Okay. One challenge, one impediment, I think, is mindset. Within manufacturers, there may be a mindset that off label use is kind of a dirty word because, you as a manufacturer are not allowed to market towards anything that is not on label or has been approved by a regulatory authority. So there's a lot of sensitivity around, collection of off label data. But I think if it's done within the context of, retrospective analyses on procedures that already happened, then I think that helps take care of that concern. But also there's a concern that, okay, well, I know this is being used in this manner, but if I acknowledge that, then I'm going to have to do something. And that is true. If a device manufacturer knows that a significant amount of off-label use is occurring, they may be pushed towards collection of data to support the use that use is safe, or they may be asked to update their labeling to contraindicate or basically give warnings to, hey, if you use it in this manner, there's no data to suggest X, Y, and Z, which ultimately means more work, right, for the manufacturer. So I think we can get around that by saying, there are pathways where you can collect this data inexpensively and utilize this data, which is high quality data that can then go into a regulatory submission. You can, for not a very heavy lift compared to traditional methods of clinical data collection, get what you need in order to, expand the label to now include this new usage. Also, if you're doing it for another reason, for instance, if you're having to do a post-market clinical follow-up study and you're, looking at patients who were treated with your device, why not get the most bang for your buck? So why not look at all of the different ways the devices are being used? That's great marketing information, because I've been a part of several studies where the product teams didn't really know the product was being used like this. And hey, maybe that's an interesting need. Obviously, it's a need, it's being done, but maybe that's an interesting market that would be valuable, to your point, add to the product's label and get more, have more revenue from this one product versus having to design a completely new product. So yeah, I think there's some impediments, and I think a lot of them are just changing the mindset within manufacturers to be open to collecting this type of data and then keeping up to date with how you're able to actually use that data to support a new label.
So if a medtech company CEO is listening right now, their takeaway should be that this is a 10x kind of way to drive your strategy and your innovation forward, because this is specifically designed to deliver the insights that are relevant for what the device is doing well, what it could be better at doing, and what more it addresses that maybe it's not even currently addressing at
Yes.
scale for the healthcare community. All of those are possible.
All of those are possible. I think there is, I'm a big proponent of get the most you can for what you have. And, a lot of, another great benefit to having access to the source data, the de identified medical record data, is that you can use that to meet post market surveillance obligations. You can turn around and look at it from a marketing perspective, you can review that same data set to support claims, marketing claims. Yeah, I think the investment in the data can, like you said, provide a 10x benefit in what comes out of it. And I know a lot of times being able to justify that expense, number one, it's less expensive than having to collect it in the course of some type of regulatory requirement. But let's say the PMCF, you have to collect data, just use that. You can justify, okay, I have to invest in this product portfolio to keep it on the market to meet these needs, but I can utilize the same data in multiple different ways. It becomes a much better investment overall.
So when we look forward at the innovation in the medtech industry and think about what's possible, is there a time where you think we're just so much more dialed in to what's needed by patients and how things can be improved that the device companies are able to deliver at a level that never before was possible and patients are benefiting? Like what's the big exciting future state of this space because of the real world evidence and the technology that we can now deploy to identify these signals that otherwise just got lost by the humans who just didn't know or see it or have time to look at it?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think, you know, focusing first on safety. I think there's been, several instances. There's even been Netflix documentaries about how, is the medical device industry safe? Thinking about the metal on metal hip implants and some of the issues that happen there. Following the products after they are placed on the market, making sure you're not picking up any additional adverse events. That is paramount to the need for post market surveillance of your products. And I think a really powerful method to collect that data is using real world data. Again, there's a ton of benefits, not least in fact the expense piece of it. But also I think, even beyond safety, I think if you were able to, I don't want to say at some point in time, it would be great if you could get contemporaneous information, right? So if the data was available to manufacturers and clinicians in a form that allowed you to draw conclusions on the data, it could speak to, changes that can impact outcomes. So if clinicians could get this access to this data right away, they could see, "Oh, okay, like, perhaps if we do this plus this, then that improves the patient outcomes by X%." From the patient perspective, if they had, up to the date information on the products and maybe the performance of the devices, and they knew a little bit about the information going into procedures, they could better be represent themselves in asking questions. I think there's a lot that you as a patient may hear about with pharmaceuticals. You see commercials and you ask questions, but I know a lot of folks who've had hip implants and they have no idea, like going into the surgery, what they're getting. And that's going to be with them, right, for probably the rest of their lives. So it may provide some, information that a patient can have to better understand and speak on their behalf on what's happening with them. I think honestly, I think there's a lot there, not to mention what we talked about with regard to, learning about the devices, how they change over time, innovation, identifying safety issues when they happen. Um, learning from a patient perspective as much as you can so you can advocate.
So creating more transparency, making it so that we can innovate faster. So you're getting the complete empirical, straight data on what is working as well, what's not in these different scenarios. So that connects to like the digital twin idea. Really, all of this also is possible only because of the place where healthcare has been and where it's going, which is this shift to more value orientation, to making things more efficient, to measuring and delivering on the promise of the best possible outcomes for patients. And I think all of that is great for everyone. So, well,
And we
we've
didn't even
come up.
talk about the healthcare economics piece of it, right? So as we think about reimbursement, understanding getting reimbursement for a product is a heavy lift on a manufacturer. But conversely, as a hospital system, as a purchasing organization for a hospital system, understanding where the value is and which products have been shown have data to prove that maybe they reduce time in the OR or have fewer reinterventions or those types of things. That data, I think, also helps to reduce cost of healthcare overall. Granted, very, very oversimplifying everything, but it feeds into the same ecosystem.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Well, we've come a long way, Amelia, since we first started collaborating
Yeah.
a few years back. And I think what I'm seeing is this incredible acceleration. And so keep doing the amazing work that you're doing. And I look forward to having you back on the podcast here in the coming year or so to report out on the continuing progress. I know 3Aware is enjoying success with the who's who of medical device companies, which is not easy to do and something that I know that I'm proud of, and I know you have to be as well. So thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you. Likewise. Yeah, we are very excited. for this work. It's been a fun ride.
Awesome. Well, the best is yet to come. And with that, we'll wrap up here. Thank you all for joining for another episode of Boombastic Health, episode 42, with Dr. Amelia Hufford on the topic of medical device real world evidence to advance innovation to benefit patients and make healthcare more efficient. I'll look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of Boombastic Health. Thanks so much. See you then.